Great. So my presentation today is called The Ethical Poison of Enmity, Embracing Truth and Rebuilding Trust for Lasting Peace. I'm going to go ahead and read my abstract and then talk through the rest of the presentation. Viewing the other side of any conflict often elevates adversarial assumptions that carry immediate and long-term moral consequences. Treating any person or group of people as enemies rather than as human beings corrodes human dignity, global cooperation, and just avenues toward peace. This presentation challenges the assumption that adversaries in conflict must be viewed and treated as enemies by drawing on the natural law tradition as a normative foundation, particularly its influence on the vision for human rights as enshrined by the United Nations post-World War II. In moments of geopolitical crisis, especially issues related to war and peace, societies often regress to factional views that promote fear, polarization, moral laziness, and dishonesty. I argue that we need alternative moral and epistemic frameworks rooted in shared human dignity and a more holistic analysis of history in order to expose and resist these factional tendencies. Through an analysis of contemporary conflicts, this essay exposes the Western moral imagination as fallible and incomplete, and examines the uncritical acceptance of pro-war narratives. It assesses how public and political discourse coupled with mainstream media narratives collapse complex realities into misleading binary categories, suppressing genuine dialogue and investigation and inhibiting peaceful alternatives. This work offers a philosophically grounded call for peace that transcends assumptions about conflict, emphasizing the natural law's call to rational deliberation, mutual respect, and the inherent dignity of every human being, even in the context of conflict. So, post-World War II, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in December of 1948. And it declares the, quote, recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as, quote, the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, emphasizing that, quote, disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and, quote, proclaims this universal declaration of human rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, to the end that every individual and every organ of society, keeping this declaration constantly in mind, shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms and by progressive measures, national and international, to secure their universal and effective recognition and observance, both among the peoples of member states themselves and among the peoples of territories under their jurisdiction. It goes on to say that, quote, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Now, I, along with many other scholars before me, have connected the UDHR to grounds in natural law theory. Natural law theory being the theory that holds that there are certain rights and moral principles that exist by virtue of human nature itself. They are self-evident, universal, and not dependent on government or culture. So we have thinkers like Paul Spickard, who discusses how the language of inherent dignity and rights in the UDHR is grounded in earlier natural rights doctrine. David Fort argues the UDHR's universalist claims align with the natural law rationale, and importantly, that these universal declarations presuppose a moral order that states must respect, not invent. There are arguments, however, against the UDHR being grounded in natural law theory. I specifically draw on David Little's Justification of Human Rights, who cautions that many drafters didn't consciously root to the UDHR in natural law theory. In practice, consensus politics shaped much of its wording. He writes, it is important to recognize that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was not designed to rest upon any single religious, philosophical, or natural law foundation. The drafters purposefully avoided grounding the document in a particular metaphysical or theological framework in order to reach a broad consensus among diverse traditions. Nonetheless, he writes, the language of the Declaration presupposes a moral order that transcends positive law. So I've given similar presentations to this topic a handful of times in the last year, and I was at the Society for Philosophy in the Contemporary World Conference back in Chicago back in July. And Eddie Souffrant of UNC Charlotte, he pestered me quite a bit about why does it even matter to have truth. And Eddie, bless his heart, was very patient with my intense passions because I didn't quite understand the question and the point that he was getting to. For me, as I've come to understand truth, it's even if there was no truth about reality, that in itself would be the truth about reality. But I let myself deliberate on this. I've thought a lot about it in the last few months. And I realize now that perhaps why it does indeed matter so much to have truth is because without truth, we devolve into nihilism and meaninglessness. A reality without truth, i.e., one that denies objective or transcendent meaning, leads us to nihilism, the belief that life lacks inherent purpose and value. We get these ideas from Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, Hannah Arendt, among others. And in The Will to Power, Nietzsche writes, "What does nihilism mean? That the highest values devalue themselves. The aim is lacking. Why finds no answer." Heidegger echoes this notion in The Word of Nietzsche. He writes, "Nihilism is the history of the truth of being as the oblivion of being." And so there's a tension here, but in the process of putting this presentation together and kind of synthesizing both sides of this argument, I came to understand that maybe it actually doesn't matter whether or not there is a transcendent truth or transcendent meaning. Because if there's no underlying truth or meaning to the reality of our lives, then our only option is to declare that meaning for ourselves. And if it's all just up to us at the end of the day, why would we not strive toward human rights and human dignity as a means for achieving peace? And indeed, post-World War II, the UDHR is exactly what we have jointly declared to be the pinnacle of human rights, goodness, and flourishing. So whether we abide by the principles of human rights as declared by the UDHR because of some kind of truth or no kind of truth, the conclusion remains the same. Navigating the world's problems through human rights and dignity is how we might actually move toward real, livable peace for all people. And with an honest look at history since the drafting of this declaration, we can see exactly where the opposite leads us. And I think the Cold War provides a very significant case study to talk about what the opposite looks like in practice. Fearing the rise of communism and the influence of the Soviet Union around the globe, the United States launched numerous military and intelligence campaigns in Latin and South America, Eastern Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and other parts of Asia in order to thwart our quote-unquote enemy. These countries include, but are not limited to, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, Chile, Panama, Haiti, the Congo, Somalia, Libya, Bosnia, Kosovo, Ukraine, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Iraq again, and Syria. The Cold War with the Soviet Union was our Trojan horse for such international interventions, and as you can see by the graphics I have on the slide, our interventions have spanned almost the entire globe. Mottos of freedom and liberty were the wheels that drove this Trojan horse, both in government and by way of public support. Hidden inside, however, were often short-term incentives coupled with short-sighted decisions that left governments and their peoples in worse conditions than before. In some instances, U.S. foreign policy actually supercharged terrorism and organized crime. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in the 1980s, we supplied the Mujahideen, the rebel fighting force acting against the Soviets, with weapons, training, and financial and other support for years. When that conflict ended, factional disputes emerged, and from the Mujahideen arose multiple extremist groups, including the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The latter would later, according to official government statements, be responsible for the devastating 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York City. Though we played a direct role in creating that level of extremism, our solution to the problem was to spend trillions of dollars, tens of thousands of lives, and 20 years in a completely futile ground war. To make matters worse, we left tens of thousands of our allies, friends, and close partners behind to suffer and die. We need to be completely open and honest about these failures and shortcomings, these avenues of approach which have ultimately been disastrous, or else we risk making the same mistakes in the present and in the future. The conference's theme this year, Decolonizing Peace, ultimately requires that we decolonize our understanding of history. To be clear, this is no justification for other evils committed by other empires. The USSR played significant roles in the proxy wars of the Cold War, and it doesn't take away from at least some of the humanitarian missions and aid that the United States has engaged in over the decades. Neither is it reflective of individual service members who join the military with the full intention of fighting the good fight. My point here is that mutual enemy relationships, such as what we see between the United States and the USSR in the Cold War, is exactly what perpetuates and completes the cycle of violence. Time and time again, we have chosen destruction over diplomacy. When the USSR fell in 1991, tensions and proxy wars did not abate. The United States was in a fresh position of power over its enemy, the now fallen USSR, but instead of leaning into diplomatic efforts bound by a commitment to peace and cooperation, we sought to expand our influence. And a prime example of this is the current war in Ukraine. Western media and media narratives have us believe that Russia is the pinnacle of evil and they're trying to take over the world, and it's up to us, the leaders of the free world, to stop them at any and every cost. The media currently denies that there was any conversation between U.S. leaders and USSR leaders in the early 90s about security assurances. However, the National Security Archives has a document titled NATO Expansion, What Gorbachev Heard. And it reads, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker's famous not 1 inch eastward assurance about NATO expansion in his meeting with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev on February 9, 1990, was part of a cascade of assurances about Soviet security given by Western leaders to Gorbachev and other Soviet officials throughout the process of German unification in 1990 and on into 1991. According to declassified US, Soviet, German, British, and French documents posted today by the National Security Archive. Of course, NATO has expanded, absorbing approximately 20 new countries in that time frame. In December of 2021, Russian President Vladimir Putin offered a draft proposal for a new U.S.-Russia security agreement. He asked that NATO did not expand eastward, and we did not take the deal. Many analysts have pointed out that this added a significant catalyst to the current conflict in Ukraine, a conflict that, as of December of 2024, is reported to have taken the lives of over 1 million people, civilian and military, on both sides of the conflict. Again, we need to be wholly, brutally, completely, and, if necessary, uncomfortably honest about the realities that we are currently navigating and how they became what they are. Treating human beings as enemies that must be destroyed or controlled only leads to greater instability and hostility worldwide. We drag millions of civilians into the mix by failing to distinguish what our actual goals are, and it's impossible to say that we've acted in any way that is aligned with peace as our ultimate aim. In conclusion, if we are going to abide by the principles of the UDHR, then we have to engage in dialogue, diplomacy, and negotiation before armed conflict, coups, and proxy wars. None of us benefit from this course of action. The only people who do are the ones who make money off of war. That's a whole other subject, but it underlines our defiance toward human rights. Human beings are not inherently endowed with price tags. Human beings are inherently endowed with dignity and rights to life and liberty. All human beings. The world cannot exist in peace if we do not treat each other as such. Though I don't deny the complexity of the situations at hand, someone has to be the first person to lay down the sword and extend an olive branch. If it isn't going to be us, then who? And why should it not be the United States and the West, generally, to actually lead the world toward true freedom and justice for all? The language of the UDHR toward true The language of the UDHR draws on the language of our own Declaration of Independence, at least in part. If we're going to claim to be the land of the free, then our actions as both individuals and a collective must follow the path of freedom, and we must recognize that freedom is the peace that we are after. Whether the transcendent metaphysical good of this reality is enshrined in some kind of natural law or is entirely up to us and our own making, it is our will and our actions in this life that determine its outcome in the future. I'm here to present on this topic not because I want to have the best argument or prove myself as a philosopher. I'm here because I care about the vision of peace that my heart has come to know, and I believe fundamentally that all of us, here in this Zoom room and well beyond the walls of this conference, do too. So, thank you.